In the middle of the Cold War, when American satellites were already photographing entire countries from orbit and mainframe computers were crunching numbers for NASA and the Pentagon, a very different kind of operation was unfolding on the streets of East Berlin. It did not involve rockets, radar, or nuclear warheads. It involved a used car, 3 store mannequins, a forged uniform, and a bet that the most dangerous border in Europe could be fooled by one of the oldest technologies in human history: confidence. On paper, the Berlin Wall and the inner German border were masterpieces of Soviet-backed engineering: double and triple fences, concrete walls topped with smooth pipe to make climbing harder, signal wires that triggered flares or automatic guns when they sensed movement, watchtowers every few hundred meters, their searchlights sweeping across no man's land while guards with Kalashnikovs watched through binoculars. This was the hardware that Moscow and its German allies pointed to when they claimed that their system was secure. But if you were an East German who stared at those fences every day, you saw something else. You saw that for all the concrete and steel, the system still depended on human beings, men in border huts checking paperwork, soldiers waving cars through checkpoints, officers who had to decide in a split second whether what they were seeing matched the picture in their heads. And wherever humans make decisions, there is room for error and for illusion. Over the years, East Germans tried almost everything to reach the American protected West. They tunneled under the wall with picks and shovels. They floated over it in homemade balloons stitched together from dress fabric and powered by propane burners. They rammed it with trucks and armored cars. They swam rivers and canals under the cover of darkness. They forged passports and transit passes and hoped the guard on duty would not look too closely. Among all those methods, a small group of escape helpers hit on a particularly audacious idea. If the wall was guarded by men who trusted uniforms and documents, what would happen if the fugitives simply put on the uniforms and carried the documents themselves? To understand how such a plan could even be imagined, you have to picture the daily theater of the border. Every day, at official crossing points like Checkpoint Charlie, Friedrichstrasse, and various inner German transit routes, East German guards watched a steady parade of vehicles come and go: Soviet military trucks, cars carrying officers in peaked caps, staff vehicles with diplomatic plates and little flags on the fenders. When those vehicles rolled up, the routine was different. They were not treated like ordinary East German workers. They belonged to the power structure that the guards themselves served. From the outside, the Soviet military machine looked impressive: columns of tanks, formations of missiles, uniforms with rows of decorations. But for an East German border guard standing at a barrier, what mattered most was not the long-range rocket, it was the short-range question: is this vehicle authorized to pass? In 1986, the world got a glimpse of just how far an ordinary citizen was willing to go to exploit that question. That year, Western papers reported on a man from East Berlin named Heinz Braun, a tire salesman who had grown tired of selling to people who could not leave the country. Unlike a tank crew or a rocket designer, Braun had no official power. What he had was an eye for detail and a willingness to risk everything on a bluff. He bought a car, a small East German vehicle, nothing special. He painted it in the matte olive green used by Warsaw Pact military units. Then he went hunting for the accessories that would turn that car into something border guards were used to seeing: a red star and hammer and sickle flag to mount on the front fender, Soviet-style license plates carefully copied, a uniform that, at a glance, could pass for that of a Soviet army sergeant, right down to the cap and shoulder boards. But Braun knew that a vehicle is not just its driver. Guards are trained to glance not only at the front seat, but whoever is in the back. So he added passengers. not real ones. He acquired 3 store mannequins, the kind that normally model dresses and suits in shop windows. He dressed them in surplus uniforms to look like Red Army officers and sat them upright in the car, one of them decorated as a lieutenant colonel. From a distance, in bad light, to a guard on a long shift, it would look like a staff car carrying a Soviet sergeant and 3 high-ranking officers, the sort of vehicle that had no reason to stop for long on its way to or from some inspection, some exercise, some secret meeting. The plan was brutally simple. Brown would put on his ersatz sergeant's uniform, climb into the driver's seat, load his officers into the back, mount the fake flag, and drive towards the border between East and West Berlin as if he had been doing it his whole life. He would not plead or sneak. He would behave the way the system expected a Soviet NCO to behave, unsmiling, impatient, entitled to pass. On the day he chose, he turned the key, listened to the engine catch, and rolled out into the streets of East Berlin. He passed apartment blocks built in socialist realist style, propaganda posters exhorting citizens to work harder for the 5-year plan, and the ever-present slogans about brotherhood with the Soviet Union. At each intersection, people glanced at the car and then looked away. It was just one more olive-green vehicle in a city full of uniforms. As he approached the border crossing, the risk spiked. The guards there were not neighborhood police. They were specialists, trained to spot inconsistencies, to link faces with passes, to react instantly to suspicious movement. But they were also human beings, embedded in a hierarchy that encouraged them to defer to certain symbols. A car painted in the right shade of military green, Soviet plates, a fluttering Soviet flag, 3 stony-faced officers in the back seat, their uniforms pressed, their caps pulled low. In the driver's seat, a sergeant in uniform staring straight ahead. According to the account later reported in Western media, Brown rolled up to the checkpoint, slowed as much as necessary, and let the image do the talking. The border guard stepped out, took in the scene, and did what the whole performance was designed for him to do. He saluted and waved the car through. In that moment, the wall might as well not have existed.
1 second, Braun was on the side of the city where the secret police had files on everyone, and leaving without permission was a crime. The next, he was across the line, on roads watched over by American, British, and French patrols. Behind him, the mannequins sat in perfect stillness, mute witnesses to one of the strangest uses of camouflage in Cold War history. If you were watching this story in the United States, you might feel a particular kind of satisfaction. Here was a system that prided itself on its security, outwitted not by some superweapon, but by a man with paint, cloth, and a good read on human psychology. The tools he used, false plates, a uniform, a flag, were low-tech, but behind them lay something very high-tech, the ability to read and manipulate a complex system of signals. It was not the first time somebody had tried a trick like this. Back in 1962, when the wall was still new and the Cold War was edging toward its most dangerous moments, Berlin papers had already carried stories of a man who put on a Soviet uniform and drove through the border as if he owned it. The details vary between tellings, and one later case was even revealed to be a hoax. But the core idea, slip into the skin of the occupying power and walk past your own jailers, was already in the air. The principle behind escape via fake police was always the same. Instead of fighting the border head-on, you impersonate the very authority the border was built to serve. Instead of sneaking through the shadows, you step into the spotlight and hope that the uniform on your back and the paperwork in your hand are more convincing than the doubts in the guard's mind. In some operations, the disguise was that of a Soviet officer, as in Braun's case. In others, helpers on the Western side forged passes and IDs that made escapees look like people with legitimate business at checkpoints, maintenance workers, authorized visitors, or even members of East German security services. The most ambitious idea, whispered among Fluchthelfer networks, was to combine uniforms, forged transfer orders, and handcuffs, a convoy of police escorting prisoners, supposedly being moved from one facility to another. Imagine how such an operation would have looked if someone had actually pulled it off. It's just before dawn at an internal checkpoint in East Berlin. The guard on duty is cold, tired, and used to seeing the same routines over and over. Workers being checked, vehicles inspected, occasional Soviet patrols passing through. He knows that somewhere out there, Western radios are broadcasting rock music and news bulletins, but on his side of the wall, the night is quiet. Then headlights appear down the road. A small convoy, 1 or 2 sedans and maybe a van, all painted in the correct shade of gray or green, all carrying the right markings for the Volkspolizei or border troops. In the front car, 2 men in uniforms. In the back seat, a prisoner in plain clothes, hands apparently restrained. Behind them, another vehicle with more officers and more detainees. The uniforms have the right cut, the right insignia, the right caps. The vehicles carry what look like official plates. As the convoy rolls up, the leader steps out with a folder under his arm, a folder that, if opened, would reveal meticulously forged transfer orders, stamps imitating those of real ministries, signatures copied from stolen letterheads. From the guard's point of view, everything checks out. This is a scenario he's been trained to expect. Prisoners being moved from one holding facility to another, perhaps to attend a court hearing or a closed interrogation. He may ask a token question. He may glance at the documents, see the right letterhead, and feel that familiar, subtle pressure not to interfere with a process set in motion by people above his rank. He waves them through. In the prisoner's seats, hearts hammer. They are not criminals being moved within a system. They are citizens being moved out of one. At the next checkpoint, where East abruptly gives way to West, the same performance repeats, except now, on the far side, the people in uniforms know they can finally relax. The handcuffs come off. The forged documents go into a folder that will eventually be passed to journalists and historians as proof of how far they were willing to go. Even if that specific fake police transfer convoy never happened exactly as described in the archives, every element of it is grounded in tactics that did. We know that East Germans and their helpers successfully passed checkpoints in disguised vehicles, like Braun's Soviet staff car with dummy officers. We know that some West Side helpers used forged papers and pretexts to move people through internal controls, making them look like they were on official business instead of running for their lives. We know that guards sometimes ignored suspicious details because the uniform in front of them looked familiar, or because the story they were being told fit within what their training had prepared them for. And we know that in many other cases, these kinds of plots were imagined, planned, and abandoned at the last minute when the risks became too high. For every spectacular escape that made the news, there were countless plans that never left the kitchen table, sketched in pencil on napkins and quietly burned when someone realized there was a Stasi informant at the meeting. From a distance, the Soviet system often looked intimidatingly modern. It put Sputnik into orbit before anyone else. It deployed armies of engineers to build dams, factories, and missiles. Its imagery, rockets on Red Square, parades of troops in perfect rows, was carefully designed to project power. But the drama of escape via fake police exposes a different truth. For all its hardware, that system remained vulnerable to a kind of soft technology the West excelled at. Understanding symbols, narratives, and human habits well enough to hijack them. When Heinz Braun painted his car and dressed his mannequins, he was not just playing dress-up. He was exploiting a hierarchy of trust that ran through the entire Eastern Bloc. A guard might be quick to question a nervous factory worker or a family with too much luggage.
he was far less likely to challenge a vehicle that screamed Soviet authority from 50 yards away. When Western agencies and broadcasters told stories about escapes like his, they did something else that mattered. They turned these individual acts of improvisation into part of a larger narrative, the story of citizens who, when faced with a wall supported by tanks and wire, responded not with despair, but with creativity. For American viewers, those stories did more than entertain. They offered proof that the ideals the United States claimed to stand for, freedom of movement, rule of law, the right to choose where you live and work, were not just slogans, they were powerful enough that people were willing to bet their lives on them. In the East, the Stasi reacted in the only way it knew how. When a car like Braun's slipped through, internal memos flew. Investigations were launched, procedures were tightened. Guards were warned that the enemy would use all means, including deception, to undermine the security of the socialist state. They tried to plug every loophole: stricter ID checks, more detailed logs of vehicle movements, new training regimens about recognizing forged documents. They built ever more elaborate layers of control. But every time a citizen managed to bluff his way past a checkpoint, it sent a different kind of message back up the chain. It whispered that the wall, for all its concrete and circuitry, could be fooled by a man in the right costume. That is what makes Escape via Fake Police such a compelling Cold War story today. It takes place at the intersection of very old and very new forms of power. On one side, you have a 20th century state using the latest surveillance methods it can afford: wiretaps, informant databases, photographic ID cards, signal fences. On the other, you have individuals playing on something as ancient as theater, costume, role, stagecraft, to get past the system's defenses. For American viewers, it's hard not to draw a line from these small operations to the larger trajectory of the Cold War itself. The Soviet bloc invested heavily in technologies of control: how to monitor, how to intercept, how to restrict. The American-led world invested heavily in technologies of connection: how to broadcast, how to travel, how to compute. When people with nothing left to lose looked across the border, they did not just see a different flag, they saw a different relationship between technology and human life. In the end, the wall did not fall because of one balloon, one tunnel, or one fake police car. It fell because the system behind it couldn't keep up with a world in which information, goods, and people were moving faster and freer every year. Stories like Braun's and all the imagined variations on Escape via Fake Police that never made it into official reports are like small cracks that appeared years before the concrete finally gave way. If you walk today along the places where those checkpoints once stood, the watchtowers and barriers are gone. In their place are memorials, museums, and ordinary city traffic: commuters, tourists, with students with backpacks. At some sites, you can see old photographs of guards in heavy coats and caps checking papers on cold mornings. Next to them, you might see captions talking about escapes: over, under, and through the wall those guards were sworn to defend. You won't see Heinz Braun's mannequins in a cage or a preserved fake police convoy, but you will see something else: the acknowledgement that the Cold War was not just a duel of arsenals, it was a contest over who could imagine a different life and make it real. Escape via Fake Police, whether in the literal form of a disguised Soviet sergeant with 3 dummy officers in his back seat, or in the broader sense of turning the state's own symbols against it, belongs to that category of stories. It reminds you that sometimes, at the sharp edge of history, the deciding factor is not who has the bigger rocket, but who better understands the minds of the men holding the rifles at the gate. And it leaves you with one last image: a small car rolling past a barrier that was supposed to last forever, its driver staring straight ahead, its officers motionless, and a border guard, trained in a Soviet system and surrounded by Soviet hardware, doing the most human thing in the world. He believes what he thinks he sees. He waves them through.